It's a great pleasure to be here, and I've had an opportunity to learn about the work at Waterloo and the work in this college, and it's both really fascinating, but also I can tell, I think, I'm among some kindred spirits, because a lot of the work that we do and the work I'm going to talk to you about today is about how we link research and real life, or as I say in the title slide, connecting science and service in better ways. And I think, the longer I've been in my career doing this kind of work, the more I find it sort of an obsession of how we do it. What are the mechanisms and ways in which we can improve, how we connect the kind of research that we do with real world problems, and how do we connect the actual environments and the actual human beings who do those different things. I think, that we forget, and I imagine lots of you who are doing research probably do them with community collaborators. You may be working in health settings or with agencies and that sort of thing. And I think that we forget that this is actually a form, in a way, of cross-cultural communication. That the exigencies and the work pressures and work goals of people who work in real-world settings and people who work in research and in laboratories are often different. The communication isn't always smooth. There sometimes is even outright mistrust between these two groups of people whose real goal is producing fundamental knowledge on the one hand, and people whose goal is serving people in the real world. And I'm going to argue that especially in the field of aging, it's absolutely critical to bring these two domains together. And so that's what I would like to talk about today. And I think that this is an issue of how we connect science and service. I'll try to argue and convince you that this is a really pressing, it's an issue of pressing importance, not just in academia or in service provision, but really for the world at large, how we do this better. So I think that some of you probably are interested or involved in aging. And let me say that as I was preparing for this lecture, I came across what I felt was an excellent statement in the field of aging of this possibly rocky relationship. The author of this very useful article began it as follows, and I'm going to quote from her. She wrote, "There's a growing conviction of many persons working on social aspects of aging of the need for a closer relationship between individuals engaged in research and those engaged in practice. And this writer, however, believes that there's a big gap there to be closed." And I quote, she says, "There's been a sometimes subtle, sometimes blunt assumption of hierarchy with the practitioners at the lower end of the order. The practical result has been to separate those with an academic orientation and primary research interest from those who are engaged in the field of practice." And she goes on to note one key problem. She writes that researchers believe that much of the work with older people is based on unproved assumptions, whereas practitioners refer to research studies as instruments to prove statistically what every good practitioner already knows. And she concludes that what we need, and this is an important word, is a device for better communication and even collaboration. So who's the source of this set of insights, which right now seem like they could have passed peer review last month? They were actually written a half century ago in the first issue of the journal The Gerontologist by someone who you've never heard of, since many of you weren't born by the time she wrote this. These words in volume 1 of The Gerontologist. She was someone named Geneva Matheson. But as I say, those words from 53 years ago, back when I was in Mrs. Shepard's second grade class learning about a new toy called the hula hoop, they could really have been written right now. And it calls into question, really, how successful we've been over 50 years, even in a field like gerontology, which does bring together research and practitioners more than others. How successful have we been in bridging science and service and research and real life in our field? It also raises the question, as valid a half century ago as it was now, what can we do, or what should we be doing to translate the body of gerontological research into things that people can use? So I'm going to address this issue today by focusing on the concept of translational research. It's a concept that attempts to treat precisely these issues that Matheson and many after her have raised. And that is, how do we create a more seamless relationship between these domains? The activities of fundamental scientific discovery in gerontology and geriatrics, the development of effective treatments and interventions, and their eventual adoption by practitioners in the community. And in nursing homes, and in healthcare settings, and in therapeutic practices, and in the policy arena. And I'm particularly taken by Matheson's turn of phrase, and I'm going to focus on this, needing devices or tools for doing this. Because in my presentation, one focus is precisely that priority. What tools and methods can we develop that better link research and practice in aging, and really more generally in science in general? Because I think that, first of all, that creating a seamless link between science and practice, and even more important, between the human beings, between scientists and practitioners, is not an easy task. And I'm going to look at this sometimes rocky relationship between research and real life today. And I want to say that this talk and my thoughts on it are based on a premise. And that's that we really, really need to more successfully and rapidly bring research to bear on human problems. And this may not be the sexiest issue, so to speak, in our society, but I actually think it's at the core of a lot of human problems. And I think it's a key issue that's confronting us, so that to improve the human condition, we simply have to overcome contemporary misunderstanding and distrust of research. And over the course of my career, there's actually has come to be a more profoundly anti-scientific set of attitudes, from distrust of vaccines to questioning climate science. So I feel that all of us doing this are actually coming up against an even stronger anti-scientific bias in the real world than we've had to deal with for a long time, as well as organizational barriers to moving research into practice domains. I do think, though, that gerontology is in a unique position to actually spearhead some of these efforts, because for as long as it's been a discipline, it's included researchers and practitioners working together. So I think that it's a good place to think about this concept of translational research. So I'd like to focus in our time together on 3 points. One of these is, what problem is translational research trying to solve? But when a new concept hits the marketplace of ideas, it needs to clearly do something that other concepts weren't doing. It needs to fill a needed gap, and in particular, it needs to solve a problem. So in using this term translational research, what problem is it trying to solve? The other thing I want to ask is, what the heck is translational research anyway? If you read this literature at all, you'll see that there have been lots and lots of articles about what translational research is and what it might mean. I think the answer is actually much less complex than meets the eye, so I'll touch on that. I think really the fundamental idea is a very simple and useful conceptualization. It's more difficult to do, and that's what I want to touch. And the final part of this talk is, we have in my center developed over the course of about 20 years some tools and techniques for bridging this gap between what researchers do and what practitioners do. And I'd like to share with you a few of those and see what you think of them. I think, that rather than more conceptual dialogue about how researchers and practitioners relate to each other, is we actually need more of a toolkit of really getting on the ground and figuring, how do we make these relationships work better? And I'll provide some examples from our work in a center called the Cornell Institute for Translational Research on Aging, which has been funded for the last 20 years by our federal government. And in a sign of how times change, it was part of a program of centers called Applied Gerontology Centers, and that got changed to Translational Research on Aging Centers. So to start out with, what problem is the concept of translational research trying to solve? And you know that when a new concept emerges in one of our fields, it faces a Darwinian battle to survive, and especially when the concept quickly becomes a buzzword. And maybe you can share later, translational research is a huge buzzword in the US right now. And it starts to be used in grant proposals and in journal articles, sometimes to make them seem cutting edge. But things get really complex and get really wild when money, and sometimes lots of it, gets involved. And in the United States, our funding sources have begun to concentrate on translational research. Hundreds of millions of dollars are being invested in so-called clinical and translational science centers. Most of the major medical centers now have them. They're funded to the tune of $30 and $40 million each, so it's a major way that federal funds are being used in the US. There are dozens of specific requests for applications that focus on translational research. So there's pressing personal interest among a lot of people to have the research they do be considered translational research, because there is a lot of money there. So I think the best way to understand what this concept is, and I want to say, I think it's, the reason why I'm talking about it today, is that I think it's an extraordinarily useful concept. I think it's one of those buzzwords that really encapsulates what we ought to be doing. And so that's one reason why I like it so much. So the problem it's trying to solve, in a nutshell, is the one I've alluded to already, which is this distant and rocky relationship between scientific research and people's real-world problems, and between scientific perspectives or worldviews and the way that most non-scientists see the world. And as I pointed out, I think this gap is really increasing. I mean, we've found that for the practitioners who we work with, for example, we've had to develop workshops on how to read a research article, because often the methods and measures now seem so arcane to people. And this problem is clear in in my own field of aging in the life course. And so what we've seen over the past 2 or 3 decades is vast expansion in research on aging in gerontology and geriatrics on the one hand, but without a lot of explicit connection to the worlds of practice. And on the other hand, a huge expansion in programs to serve older people, but which are not scientifically tested. And in most of the programming, at least in the United States for older people, despite a lot of talking about evidence-based programming, most actual practical programs aren't based on research, and research isn't systematically used to actually develop them. And let me give you just one example from a study we did. Our center, this Cornell Institute for Translational Research on Aging, does a lot of its work in New York City. And for those of you who don't know, Ithaca is in central New York, about 3.5 hours away. All of us have enormous incentive to have projects in New York City because we like to have actual good restaurants and theater to go to. So that's not the only reason. It's also a wonderful, diverse, multicultural environment in which to do research. And we have a community partner there called the Council of Senior Centers and Services, which represents almost all the community-based elder service providers in New York City. So it's all the senior centers and a lot of other groups. And those directors are mostly master's level social workers or adult educators. So they're people who've had some research training and should have some understanding of it. And so we did a survey of these community partners, asking them how interested they were in research and how much they use it in their daily work. And just to give a few examples, 3/4 said they really didn't have time to read research, even though they would like to, by about the same amount. The vast majority actually said, that more money ought to be spent on services and less money on research. And in general, this survey showed that much of what researchers do was out of their comfort zone, and they rarely ever consulted a research finding or relied on researchers for their work. So it's these kind of differences which have brought out the need for translational research. Agencies who fund research and the general public are starting to ask, what are we getting out of hundreds of millions of dollars annually on basic research? I mean, in the United States, billions of dollars probably have been spent on Alzheimer's research without much hope for a cure. So people are saying if this research stays in the ivory tower, discussed only small groups of academics interested in the minutiae of a subfield of a subfield of a subfield, why are we funding it? In addition, there's good evidence that it takes too long for basic research to ever find its way into treatments. And in the biomedical world, they've identified a gap between a significant basic research finding and a usable application of almost 2 decades. And most basic research never makes it into practice at all. So that's an important part of the gap. So to show you graphically from our local area in central New York, the concept is to move from these silos where research and application are seen as entirely separate endeavors that come together only when we insert a paragraph at the end of a research article called Implications for Practice, and to move to a bridge. This is one of Cornell's famous suspension bridges. But the bridge means that these are not seen. The concept of translational research implies that these are not seen as parallel streams of endeavor that come together occasionally, but rather that research and practice concerns have to be intertwined at every step of the process, from conceptualizing a research study to its actual use in the field. So that instead of these parallel lines, that the scientific activity and the desire to improve the human condition have to go hand in hand. And let me say, the reason why I think that's so important is when, perhaps some of you have tried this, if people try to engage research faculty who have research as a part of their career objectives, into community-based research, it's often seen as service of some kind. And the beauty of translational research as a concept is it honors both of these activities equally, and that people who are doing it ought to be able to publish their results in top journals. So it contributes both to science and to practical gain, and I'll come back to that. So what is translational research? My colleague at Cornell, Elaine Wethington, and I went through about 350 articles at one point. And using a set of selection criteria, we chose articles that use translational research as a term. And the defining component of most definitions, one thing is in all of them, and that is a movement from basic science to practice in some form, but always including both. And almost all definitions include the idea of speeding up this process of translation and making it intentional and systematic. So, one way of looking at it is the way research findings now are currently used is if you imagine a highway where hungry people are standing on the side of the highway and trucks laden with food are going down the highway, and every once in a while a box of cabbages or a live chicken falls off and people eagerly use it. That's the way that research findings are typically used for treatments or interventions. And the idea behind this is the systematic translation of research findings into the development of innovative interventions. So that's sort of part one, is that we're taking research findings and basing interventions on them, and that those ultimately improve real-world practices. And then there is a back translation from community, healthcare, other settings that inform basic research. And for the work we do, we really use this figure where there are three key steps, so that the basic research and theory inspire intervention design, because that gets people out of simply basing interventions on conventional wisdom or practice wisdom of some kind, and gives them more of a theoretical and empirical basis. Then interventions are tested, typically using randomized controlled designs. And then the findings from the intervention research lead to a reconfiguration of program design but also lead to new thinking about science. There's certain things that you can only learn about by testing them experimentally in real-world settings, and that's the idea behind this. So the features of translational research are intentional acceleration of findings from research to practice, making it, as I said, intentional and systematic, not, I'll do some research and maybe it will have some kind of a relevance. A key thing I'm going to be talking about in the rest of this talk is the actual creation of environments, of helpful and supportive environments that bring researchers and practitioners together and facilitate equal status, productive dialogue. And that you have close consultation with the stakeholders or the end users of research throughout the entire research process, not just at the end. And for us, it's really key to study the translational process itself. So how do we make this better? So in the remainder of my time, I would like to give you a few examples of stuff that we've tried to do. And in each of these cases, we've developed a new technique for improving researcher-practitioner relationships. And in each case, we have studied it and published it. And in some cases, there's a manual or at least an article that would tell other people how to do it. I think one of my favorite social scientists, Elvis Presley, said that, we need a little less talk and a little more action. And I think that's really what we felt here is people, I could sing that but that'll be tonight after a few drinks. No. So in the field of gerontology, I already pointed out, that we've bemoaned this lack of relationship. And let me illustrate. I think it's not like whether we ought to be developing new ways of doing this, but it's how we do it. And Harold Pincus, who's at Columbia, I'm indebted to him because he identified what he calls translational valleys of death. And in this case, so you start with basic research on aging, and there's valley number one, where the research findings never get, to intervention. And then you have interventions working on their own, and then there's valley two, and it never gets out into actual practice. So how do we, just as we need a knowledge base in many substantive areas, we also need a knowledge base for how to bridge these valleys, so to speak. What we need is a toolkit. This is my workshop at home. Now, actually, if anyone who knew me would know how hilarious that statement is, because if I could hire someone to change light bulbs, I would. So that is absolutely not my workshop at home. But the argument is that, in fact, I don't think I own a single one of those tools anywhere. But I do want to say that this is really what we need is a toolkit to make this happen. So I'd like to offer you several problems. So if you're creating a translational research center, as we did, or as I imagine in this school people are certainly engaging all the time with communities, what problems do we typically encounter? And what are more evidence-based and systematic ways that we could address them? So I'd like to give you 3 examples if time allows. So a problem one is it's great to talk about engaging community members. But how do we actually get them involved? How, if you're starting, so imagine you're starting a project on increasing physical exercise among older people, or reducing diabetes among minority populations, or encouraging people to consider joint replacement. And you really want to do this translationally, and you want to involve stakeholders and end users in the work you're doing. It's actually much easier said than done. These things are actually pretty difficult. So in any research community partnership, there also is a really strong chance that researchers' voices will dominate. Usually researchers we have access typically to the large-scale federal funding that creates the whole project. Usually researchers are the one who reach out and identify the issue, and they usually initiate the relationship with community partners. So how, if you're trying to establish what the important priorities are to study in a partnership, how do you overcome those differences in expertise, and knowledge? So early in the history of our center, of CITRA, I'll call it, the Cornell Institute for Translational Research on Aging, we and our main partner, this Council for Senior Centers and Services, collaborated on an effort to map the range of issues that that researchers and practitioners saw as facing older people in New York City. So somehow we wanted to set the priorities for the next 10 years of this center. And the purpose was to create these priorities that would help us decide what pilot projects to fund, what kind of researchers to mentor, which agencies to work with. And what we did was we used a technique that actually was developed by a guy named William Trocham at Cornell called concept mapping. And we've had for a long time a paper in progress that still has not yet actually seen the light of day about using concept mapping in community research or partnerships. And so instead of just doing a survey or a few focus groups, this technique turned out to be extraordinarily useful for our interactions with community partners. And if you don't know about concept mapping, it's a mixed methods planning and evaluation procedure that combines commonly used group discussion techniques like brainstorming and focus groups with very sophisticated multivariate statistical analysis and mapping techniques. But people who are going to use this don't have to know anything about those statistics. Instead, what concept mapping results in is an easily understandable series of highly descriptive maps that visualize the relative value and relationships among priorities identified by stakeholders. And at each stage of the process, these stakeholders are actively doing something. And so they're always engaged in activities to set priorities, like labeling and interpreting initial findings and setting priorities. So it's highly suited to a community research partnership. And let me give you an example. In this case, participants basically brainstorm a set of statements relative to the topic of interest. Then people individually sort them, and they can either do it physically, people sort these statements into piles, or of course now it can be done online. Then they can rate each statement in terms of things like how important it is, or its feasibility. And then you interpret the maps that result from these analyses. So in our case, our community partners and the researchers working together developed this prompt. One specific issue, that is a problem, trend, or opportunity that must be addressed, and this was 10 years ago. So, and this has shaped the whole development of the center over 10 years, which must be addressed to meet the needs of older people in New York City by 2015 is blank. And they could come up, even though it says one, people came up with 5 to 10 or more of these kinds of statements. So 250 agency service directors, advocates, and other folks created responses to this prompt, which resulted in 1,500 ideas. And then what the software does is it synthesizes these into 95 statements. And then what people do is they sort these statements into piles and they rated them in terms of importance. So if you can imagine the kind of thing which something like this might generate, because it involves factor analysis, other kinds of things. And what it actually generates is something that looks like this, where folks could see that there were 13 clusters of activities, ranging from housing, capacity of community services, communication. The size indicates how many people thought they were important. And topics are geographically close to one another that are related. So for example, caregiving, special needs, and mental health and impairments are all close together. Then an additional graphic representation shows how important people thought they were. So in New York City, capacity of community services and housing were considered to be especially important, as was caregiving. So it's very easy for people to interpret, to discuss, get involved in, and it really made them feel a part of this process. Indeed, they referred to it, and this was sort of, the Bible. People, continue to talk about this initial process. So it's engaging, interesting, satisfying to people. The graphic descriptions are highly user-friendly, much more so than statistics would be. It really helps both community partners and the researchers involved feel heard as part of this. And you can focus on things which are both feasible and important. So actually, it creates kind of a go zone, as you can find which things people care about, they see as feasible to work on and important. Like, so some might say, probably the statement was, eliminate poverty among older people, which would have been rated as highly important, but not particularly feasible. However, passed legislation around adaptability of apartments that was seen as important and feasible, as an example. So, but this was one way, and we actually use this. So, for example, our funding of pilot studies throughout the course of the center has been based on these priorities, and these, of course, have been updated over time. So that's one problem and a solution, is that if we're going to try to set priorities with people who we want to work with in an ongoing partnership, let's think of ways that are more intuitive from a practice perspective, and again, are ones that they can interpret as well as we can, even with our better statistical knowledge. A second problem is that this really is, actually there was a wonderful article by the social psychologist Walter Stephan, S-T-E-P-H-A-N, who's done a lot of work on cross-cultural and cross-racial communication. And he wrote a great paper on research and practice as cross-cultural communication, and how the priorities and ways that people think about problems differ so dramatically. And some of those are obvious, like we found that with our community partners, timelines are incredibly different. People want an answer now or soon to a pressing problem, not until we've done a full study and had a peer-reviewed article or more on it. Practitioners are much more interested in some ways in anecdotal evidence and in what they can see and experience and what's worked in the past, rather than some of this more kind of arcane evidence-based stuff. And this is what studies have found. So I think it's true that often people don't speak the same language, and this is an important issue. And the one thing that we've created, and we've published a number of articles on this, and we actually have a manual on how to do this, that we also have available online, is something we termed the Research to Practice Consensus Conference Model. I will say this is one of the most enjoyable sort of methods that we've developed. It really is kind of revelatory for people involved, so I have a little bit of a missionary zeal about it. So it takes, the standard consensus conference, which I imagine that some of you here have been involved in, which typically involves only scientists. Our Institute of Medicine, for example, convenes them frequently if it wants to know the importance of vitamin D and bone health or something. The scientists all come together and they come up with a consensus on priorities in the area. And usually the practitioner involvement is something called an open session or a town meeting at the end. And that's really the degree to which practitioners are involved. So we adapted that model to bridge this gap and to bring researchers and practitioners into a setting where they operate as equal status partners talking about research priorities. So both groups engage in this discussion of research priorities. So, and the goal of these research to practice consensus conferences are to generate practice-based ideas for new research directions that are responsive to the needs of service providers and their clients. And the idea is not, these are not suggestions for what to do. It's asking practitioners, what do you need to know to do your job better? And can we align that with researchers' priorities? And so the idea is to create a joint conception of an aging-related problem. with both groups working together. And I'll be brief because I can send this to you, but it begins with a research review that's done in a non-technical style. An existing research review or Cochrane review could be adapted for this. In our cases, each time we've done them ourselves. Then the workshop begins with presentations by at least 2 expert practitioners and expert researchers. The idea is to model the equal importance of both viewpoints at the beginning. But then using small group discussion and group interaction, a research agenda is created. People vote on research priorities, both researchers and practitioners together. And there's a follow-up roundtable to establish top priorities and then the publication of results. In many cases, these conferences have actually resulted in some ongoing working group. So for example, we did one on chronic pain in New York City, and a group of researchers and practitioners have continued to meet around issues of persistent pain. So for example, we've done these topics. So we have a brand new one that the article's coming out this month in the American Journal of Public Health on palliative care, but on things like fall prevention, on social isolation, elder abuse and neglect, and so forth. And let me give you one example. Each one of these consensus conferences has come up with often striking differences for research directions from standard consensus workshops, and we've looked at these. So for example, in the field of elder abuse, if anyone happens to be interested in it, researchers are extremely concerned about establishing prevalence. And there have been studies in Canada, actually one of which I was involved with, and people continue, to want to know exactly what the morphology of this is, and practitioners really don't care that much about that. They see it, they understand it, they know it's a widespread problem, and they want to know things like best approaches for dealing with abusers, because that's really difficult for them. Or how culture affects elder abuse is something that was not really dealt with much in the literature. Or they want evidence-based strategies for training professionals, not just for intervening with people. So that's an example of how these differences are. And the final thing I want to talk, and then I'll to mention, and this might be relevant for folks here. Most universities, I don't know specifically, but most universities do pilot study programs. I imagine there are small pilot grants available here too. And we were, as we've developed this center, actually have not found demand to be problematic on the part of our community partners. They actually are extremely eager to have researchers involved. In fact, we've generally found that our community partners want rigorous research. They actually would really like to have people working with them. But there was a little bit of a feeling of giving a party with no one coming, or building it and no one came. It is difficult to get researchers out of their, comfort zone. People, if you can do experiments on our equivalent of white mice, namely college undergraduates, why would you go elsewhere? Or there are sometimes big respondent pools for older people. So there are some barriers for faculty doing this kind of thing. Often they lack experience working with practitioners. So one thing we do is we go with them as they're developing these practitioner relationships, and sometimes those meetings don't go well. Translational research and research in community settings is time-consuming. Again, there's this issue of perceived lack of career benefit for doing this kind of work, and what we have to insist to people is this is real fundamental research, just happens to take place in community settings. And also there are IRB concerns, that people really are unfamiliar with IRB issues in this. So how do we get them to do it? So we started out having a conventional pilot study program where you issue an RFP for small grants, in our case, $10,000 or something like that. You review them in a cursory way. The funds are awarded, and people very rarely follow up with these sort of institutional pilot programs. Actually, we sometimes find that people don't actually use the funding. They often return it because they haven't really planned what to do with it, and that wasn't creating these kinds of translational efforts. So what we did is we instituted a pilot study program in which people had to have a community partner. So they had to work with a community agency, typically in New York City. The researcher and the collaborator were considered co-PIs. They had to provide some funding to the agency who was collaborating, so they were no longer asked to do something for nothing. We had a committee of researchers and community members who actually went over the proposals, and typically these resulted with the practitioners on publications from the study. And let me give you a couple of examples of how this worked, because I think it really turned out to provide some interesting results. One was a fascinating issue that we encountered in New York City. Are any folks here from nutrition or mostly work in nutritional issues? There was an enormous brouhaha in New York City when under Mayor Bloomberg, it was decided as a cost-saving measure, you would transition from a daily home-delivered meal to a stack of frozen dinners that people would put in a microwave. And this raised an enormous outcry in the press. This is an article from a Korean senior center, which describes how people are getting kimchi and bulgogi in their meals, and how could this possibly be done in the form of a frozen meal? The concept was that people wouldn't eat them, people would steal them, they would be unappetizing and so forth. So our community partners came forward, it was generated by them, and said, look, we've got a political decision going on here on which there's no data, will you study it? And we had an eminent nutritional researcher, Ed Frangelo. A community partner was a huge Meals on Wheels group called City Meals. And we saw this as a natural history experiment where we did a big survey pre and post. Now actually our community partners were not so happy because it didn't really make that much of a difference and people were relatively happy with the meals. But it still was, at least it served to reassure people that this was not Armageddon occurring. A second example of this was we had a researcher this is at the United Hindu Cultural Center in New York City, where the study took place. A researcher named Arun Rao, who himself was an East Asian Hindu, was very interested in and he's a geriatrician interested in palliative care. He found that his East Asian Hindu patients and their families were resistant to pain management at the end of life. And in talking to people, in part it seemed to him that this was due to karmic beliefs, that people felt that their chances in a next life were increased by suffering in this one. Also, I should say, in New York City, there is a large population of East Asian Hindus from the Caribbean. And this was particularly strong in those immigrants. So he really wanted to understand this, and he did several surveys of end-of-life care preferences with the United Hindu Cultural Center. And then this methodology and survey were actually replicated among other groups in New York City. And it created a very long-term relationship between him and this agency for research purposes. And neither of these, we think, would have happened without this innovative program. So in conclusion, as you can tell, I feel passionately about this need for these kind of translational research approaches. And above all, I think that all of us doing research in aging ought to ask, how can we create environments, actual physical or organizational environments, where translational research optimally occurs, and especially where new techniques for research translation can be developed. And I'd like to harken back to one of the original translational researchers on aging, even before that term was used, M. Powell Lawton, who wrote a classic article called Ecology in the Aging Process. And he suggests that people exist in environments that either support or hinder optimal quality of life and work. And he points to these three components: resources, incentives, and constraints. So with that in mind, I think we need to ask, how can we create institutes and centers and programs that provide needed resources? And what are the most important resources? What incentives can we provide to researchers and agencies to work together, both to gain new knowledge and to solve human problems in later life? And how can the constraints to this kind of productive interdisciplinary activity be overcome, and what can we do to overcome them, or at least be reduced? Now, I would answer those questions for you. Unfortunately, my time is up. So, but maybe you have some ideas and we could discuss them here. But I think this is the direction in which we need to go and to start to disseminate some of how we do this. And I think we do have a little time for questions.
We definitely do.
Or thoughts, feelings, strong emotions, interesting personal anecdotes. Sure. So would you mind telling me who you are when you'd like to, so I have some?
Okay, sure. My name is Laura Bruin-Martin, and I'm with the Research Institute for Aging here in Kitchener. We can talk later if you like. My question is, if the original paradigm is 17 years from research to practice, has anyone tried to quantify how that might change with translational research?
You know, that is a really good question. And I don't know, that really is kind of more came from sort of a bench to bedside drug development paradigm or for treatments. The clinical and translational science centers argue that they are doing it more quickly. So that you know, because they have these research navigators, and they do directly involve people in clinical practice in these research projects now to a much greater degree. So even people working at the molecular level work in these labs side by side somehow now, sometimes with practitioners. And they believe, and they're showing evidence that things are moving more quickly, but it hasn't been quantified. Actually, that's a really good question, though. I'm going to have to look in and see if that's been revised. You know, that was a classic study of maybe 20 years ago, and then people who continue to track this seem to argue that there still is that basic finding to treatment gap, but that would be interesting to see. Yeah, that's a good question. Other? Have I talked you into stupefied silence? Sure. You and then.
Bob from psychology. You've talked a lot about how this has become a buzzword and it's found its way into grant funding. And I'm wondering about, are there other models of translation that are out there? And do you think that there's some danger that the overuse of this in using methods that don't meet these standards is potentially going to, you know, contaminate the brand, if you want? And so how are you, and if so, how are you sort of dealing with that? How have you been successful promoting this model against competing models?
You know, that is an excellent question, and there is such a word soup right now around this. So, you know, from calling something applied research to diffusion research to dissemination. So I think that is actually causing an enormous amount of confusion. People then began to talk about type 1 translational research, which is from basic research into a treatment, and type 2 translational research from treatment into community practice, and then type 3 translational research into some amorphous kind of diffusion. And a lot of that has been, again, because people want to be able to apply for this funding, and calling themselves translational research becomes a part of it. So I think that I don't have as much of an answer as to say that this has not been standardized as to actually what it is. It is much more standardized in medical environments where it really is conceived of as bench to bedside work. And so I think in that sense, that's much clearer. That, you know, you have some kind of basic discovery and it moves into a drug or some other therapeutic treatment. Within the social sciences, though, it's extraordinarily mushy. I have personally argued, I don't know how much influence it's having, but I think at least in some small way, that the real core part of this, the part of it which really makes a difference is movement from basic research into some kind of application. That, you know, that these other things all have other names and other things we can consider them, like, you know, kind of efficacy and efficiency trials or other things like that. But the real problem is that research, at least in the field of aging, is almost never used to inspire program development, or at least only vaguely. Like, so that's the focus that we have. You know, actually studying the term and the way it's used would also be really good. But no, I don't think there's been success in standardizing what this means. And I think it's still pretty much all over the place. That would be an interesting topic to look at. I'd love to just share one anecdote too, that as we were doing this big research to practice consensus effort around fall prevention, there was legislation in New York City to mandate grab bars in bathrooms in New York City apartments. And what the research shows is that those kind of adaptations are never cost effective unless the person has an actual problem, that they really don't have any preventive help. All of our advocate friends had been advocating this, you know, for so long that they simply denied the finding. I mean, they just simply, it just sort of just kind of went ahead. So you're right, if something is highly conflicting with what people really believe, it is difficult. You know, part of, you know, the ways that one can deal with that, you know, to some extent, are the ones I'm sure that most people are aware of. Is, for example, that we often don't, if we develop an intervention, actually manualize it and describe to people issues of what they can adapt and what they can't, and problems of sort of openly adapting programs, you know, that have an evidence basis. So I think that one thing that we've discovered, actually, I can answer this in such great detail, I'm going to do a mental outline. So one is making sure that agency partners understand some of these fundamentals. That's one. Two, something else we found, and I hope this is relevant to what you were asking, that's been extremely effective that I didn't mention, is a program that we developed called a Research Navigator program. And with community agents who we work with, we actually will have a 3-day training where people come in, one person from the agency, who gets an intensive training in research methods. Representatives of each research method, like experimental work or surveys, come and give presentations. And issues like this are discussed. Why a randomized control design is important. Why you can't simply and freely adapt an evidence-based program. And we found that when there's a champion like that in an agency, it's much easier to get them to continue to stabilize the program, to institutionalize it. It's almost like having a research coach or sort of champion in the agency. And that actually has worked very well, especially with our partners in New York State. You know, the other thing though, unfortunately, and I know this is sort of controversial, is that in the same way that all the work to encourage people to wear seatbelts was less effective than passing legislation, when these entities who fund agencies demand use of evidence-based programs and practices, they do start to use them. So in the field of aging in the US, to obtain funding for a lot of the programs that are sponsored by the Administration on Aging, people must use registered evidence-based programs. And that that's encouraged an incredible appetite to learn more about this. It also stifles some of their own creativity. But so I think that's another factor. But I think it is an ongoing process of education is the best way to do it. And you're absolutely right. I mean, people will take a finding and bend it to their own needs. I think that we find anecdotally, the more people have been involved throughout the research process too, the less likely they are to do that. That's a great question. Sure.
Myra Hernandez from Psychology. I had a question. I was really interested in the method that you use to collaborate with different agencies and surveys and such to determine the key issues. I was wondering if you think that the results would be any different if you actually consulted the seniors themselves rather than the agency. not to say that there would be different interests there, but there could be other issues that are very important that come up that aren't the ones that the agencies are picking up on for whatever reason. And I wondered what suggestions you would have for how to actually gather that information, either from normal aging individuals or from people or their caregivers, because they might not be able to fill out surveys and such. How would you go about that?
Right, and that is absolutely something I should have mentioned. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. In our community-based research partnership model, it's true that agencies are our partners, so that it's not actually the community members they're serving. So so the focus of our center is developing ways for agencies to do their work better, and that is the perspective that we really are getting. We have a couple of times, so with the palliative care consensus workshop and with our chronic pain consensus workshop, we actually involved individuals affected by the condition in those workshops, and it worked pretty well. I think our next step is to use that very same model with actual community members and see how it works. So we just haven't, it sort of hasn't really been in our portfolio. I think the findings would be quite different in some ways. I do want to add, though, the way in which we have done this, and we have an article published on this, so we developed a method, we just love these acronyms, and this one is called MPACE, which was a method for involving community members in modifying evidence-based programs. And in that study, and I can give you the reference, so we took the Arthritis Foundation self-help program for arthritis management, which some of you may know, and working with pain sufferers in diverse communities, got them to work in modifying that program and improving it. And they engaged in very similar things. They went through the program, we interviewed them throughout the process of being in the program, and then they came together in groups to critique it. So that, and then it was possible to come up with a modified version of that particular evidence-based program. That's as close as we've come. And that was in the context of taking an established evidence-based program and getting actual community members to look at it. And yeah, it's just a gap in what we've done, and it's kind of a next step. It should be our next grant proposal. That's a good. So I think, as our psychotherapist would say, I think we've come to the end of our time. Oh, sorry. Sure.
Well, I was just going to respond because I have now become one of that member of the aging, and I'm a member of RAP, the Waterloo Research Aging Pool, where they bring people in, and I've also sent some of my friends to, and when we get together, talk about your incentives, we're really interested in all this. So I think it's a bottom up that, just like the last person said, that it's important to get people like me involved, because then they're educated and they're more willing to go along with the incentives.
Absolutely, and you have a respondent pool like that. That's that's great. And so you're one. It's a terrific opportunity.
I've gone for several years and I love it.
No, it's really. I think it's really enjoyable. Yeah, but that's another use of respondent pool folks as well, is to use folks like you to think about what important research priorities might be.
And I was part of the arthritis self-help group.
Ah.
That was part of my background too.
Oh, really? Yeah, because that was very interesting, and we found that people did culturally, want to adapt the program in different ways, and there were kind of a different interest in terms of how much physical activity should be involved and other things. Yeah, and that's a great program. All right, well, thanks everybody. Great being with you.